Hello, my name is Gareth Machin and I am the Artistic Director of Wiltshire Creative. Last year, as part of the 2019 Salisbury International Arts Festival, we introduced a new strand of work. Our Festival of Ideas was an opportunity to bring together a range of brilliant, knowledgeable and provocative speakers in a series of conversations that responded to the themes and ideas behind the artistic offer. Building on the success of our inaugural programme, we had planned a similar event this year. The 2020 festival was to have been a response to the 800th anniversary of the founding of the city of Salisbury. In 1220, the Bishop of Old Sarum, facing a host of environmental and economic challenges, took the extraordinary decision to move his city 3 miles south and rebuild on the floodplain of the River Avon, the current site of Salisbury. We were fascinated by the idea that 800 years ago there had been an opportunity to build a city from scratch. In our time, when we see the identity, functions and structures of cities under considerable pressure, we wanted to use the inspiration of 1220 as a stimulus to ask questions about the future of cities in the 21st century. Of course, this was all before COVID-19 and the cancellation of the International Arts Festival in Salisbury. We are very grateful, however, to all the speakers who had agreed to participate in the live event for their willingness to continue the programme online. The questions we'll be asking feel even more relevant in the light of the pandemic, and I'm sure will inform some of the debate. But I also hope that the shadow of the coronavirus will still allow for the underlying issues around cities to be considered. Thank you for your interest in our work, and we hope you enjoy the event.
Morning, everybody. Welcome to the What Next for Cities, Salisbury 2020, big weekend, Festival of Ideas. My name's Andrew Kelly from Bristol Festival of Ideas and Festival of the Future City. This is an important moment for cities. As the world rapidly urbanises, we need to make cities work for all. Yet there's been talk during COVID-19 about, does this mean the end of cities, particularly the big cities? Now, cities are remarkable things. They're resilient things. And I don't think it is the death of the cities. But the issues raised by COVID-19, inequality, housing issues, around future work, the environmental crisis and more, as well as issues like democracy and trust, were there before the crisis and will be there afterwards. So is this the time, the great reset moment, to get cities right? This is part of the Festival Ideas weekend on the future of cities. I'm delighted to have with me a fantastic panel to discuss these issues. Jess Clark, former member Stage 65 and Wiltshire Creatives. Alan Lane, Artistic Director, Slung Low. John Glen, MP for Salisbury, Economic Secretary to the Treasury and a former Department for Culture and Media Sport Minister. And Cleo Lake, artist, Director of Black Artists on the Move, Green Party and a former Lord Mayor of Bristol. Thank you very much for joining us. We're going to start with 3 to 5 minutes from each member of the panel. And I'm going to start with Jess Clark. Jess, thank you very much.
First off, I'd just like to say thank you so much for letting me get involved. This is really cool for a young person to get involved with. So I just want to preface this by saying I've lived in Salisbury my entire life. Salisbury born and raised, so being able to talk about the issues within our community is really important to me. Firstly, I'd like to jump straight into a young person's perspective and talk about nightlife, finances and student life in general. Firstly, finances are absolutely terrifying for a young person in this day and age. From my own experiences, I've personally been concerned about finances and money since I started work at 16. And this is something that is going to be there forever, especially in this economic climate, unfortunately. But finance and education completely go hand in hand. So it's vital that young people who come to the area to study can find work as well as enjoy themselves when they're not studying. There's lots of structural developments that are happening to Wiltshire College on the Salisbury campus, which I think are fantastic for the city. But by attracting a higher number of students to Salisbury, they're going to want jobs and they're going to want things to do. So I think by supporting the local nightlife, it will increase jobs, it will increase traffic into the city, and will help the local economy greatly. Another thing I wanted to briefly discuss is youth groups available within the city. Unfortunately, there's a real lack of town-based youth groups that aren't sports related. We used to have places like the Unit and At Home Salisbury who would provide safe spaces that were welcoming, non-discriminatory venues for young people to learn new skills. But because rates, unfortunately, are so expensive in terms of rent, and funding is so hard to come by, these places can't exist within the city centre. I used to frequent them all the time when I was in school. I was able to talk about issues, especially LGBTQ+ issues, with my friends. So I think having the opportunity of youth groups that aren't necessarily sports related is really important. And then finally, less of a general talking point and more of a consideration, especially from my point of view, is one of visible and invisible inequality within education, within the workplace, and with the theatre arts. It's a really important issue to consider when we're trying to create opportunities for people within the city. Being mindful of equality in terms of gender, race, financial background, disability is really important to make sure that everyone in the community can play an equal part and have access to the same opportunities in order to improve their everyday life. Within the workplace, disability access within the arts is another thing that's really rife at the moment. Higher education for individuals that are terrified of the finances that come with it. It's really important to consider when we're trying to create opportunities within our community.
Thank you very much, Jess. We'll be taking up some of these issues as we move forward with the discussion. Just a reminder, do put your questions in the Q&A box and we'll come to them after the initial discussions. John Glen, thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you for the opportunity to contribute. And it was very good to hear Jessica's contribution there, and I'll pick up on some of the issues that she's raised. I mean, I grew up in rural North Wiltshire, but I've lived in Salisbury over the last 10 years. And I was the arts minister very briefly, sadly, for only 6 months, and went all around the country and saw lots of expressions of arts, cultures, and different ways of developing arts as a core part of a city's growth and future development. And I've always tried to take those lessons and bring them back to Salisbury. And my job obviously is to fight for the city in Westminster, but also to help bring better collaboration together locally so that we can build a sustainable future. Now, Salisbury is an example of a city. We are a city by virtue of the cathedral, not really having the same characteristics of, you know, a Sheffield or a Leeds or a Bristol. I was at school in Bath for 10 years and obviously that's again a different scale. So each city will have to approach this in a different way, and we'll have a different culture and set of historic challenges. Now in Salisbury, Wiltshire Creative is the exemplar for the Arts Council in the South West in terms of collaboration, bringing different parts of the arts community together. And I think that they have done a fantastic job. Obviously the festival's been postponed this year, but with Stage 65, the youth theatre that I think Jess is involved in, and then also the work they've done with community hubs, with contemporary dance, filling the gap work for people over 60s. And I just think, I tried to distill sort of 3 key elements that I think are really important to have a vibrant city based on the arts, which I think Salisbury should really consider very carefully. I think we've got to have a place-specific vision that's relevant to the history and the values and the aspirations of the people. And that's been brought to, you know, I've tried to facilitate bringing that together with a cultural pillar, working on a vision for the future of the arts in Salisbury. And then we also need a resilient organisational structure that brings people from all political backgrounds, shades of opinion, and actually tries to identify the gaps and work collaboratively in a non-partisan way to solve that. But then the element that I think, Andrew, that I just finish on saying is that we talked about inequality, environmental issues, all those things are very important. But we also got to recognise we need to create the wealth, we need to create jobs to invest and people paying taxes, a growing economy so that people at all levels will contribute to the arts. And we have that with our excellent playhouse, we have it with the Arts Centre, and we have lots of expressions through live music in Salisbury. But we've got to not lose sight of the fact that money and resources come from a vibrant economy. And that's something that I think we've also got to put the heart of it. I think that's something that Jess mentioned is critical as well.
Thank you very much, John. We'll be coming back to those points as well. The next in order is Cleo Lake. Cleo, thank you very much.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. And I'm very happy to be here virtually in Wiltshire today, down the road and linked by the River Avon. So greetings from Bristol to everyone who's tuned in. So when approaching this question, for me, I like to think about, well, what is the offer that cities might be giving to their citizens and who is giving that offer? I think that's an important element to frame. So when considering that, what are potentially the opportunities around democracy, digital interactions, elements like food sovereignty, good housing, clean air, education, and also, of course, festivals, entertainment, and the cultural offer? These are all aspects that make up the city landscape. Local councils, and I speak as a local councillor in Bristol, we are of course limited in some ways by our relationship with national government, and that has to be taken into account. It limits what we can do, it places financial burdens on the city as well from the council and local authority perspective. I believe that actually going forward we need a radical reimagination of how we do governance and how we do interactions. And that can be right across the board, from how we collect taxes and distribute them to how we make decisions. Also, how can opportunities actually be shared and marketed so that they actually reach everyone? Well, to make that happen, of course, it's really important that we have digital inclusion. Right now in Bristol, I know that we have hundreds, if not thousands of people who cannot get online, who do not have a device or do not have the means to actually get online. So when it comes to homeschooling, in inverted commas, this is excluding some people. So we actually need to work hard to make sure that we can fill those gaps where either the council or the government cannot meet those. So again, the private sector or independent communities need to step in and not just rely on city councils. In terms of power sharing beyond tokenism, I would advocate that we actually need to form citizens' assemblies in order to make local decisions and make them more meaningful for people, and importantly, bring out underground conversations into the mainstream. I often hear comments and questions in terms of why aren't certain people engaged in the conversation, such as climate change and everything else? Well, actually, people are engaged in the conversation. It's just that perhaps they're not sat around the same table as you. So it's about how do we gather those voices, the genius of ideas that exist, whether it was in the community centre on the street corner, in the pub, in the prison, amongst prison walls. How do we get that information and how do we share those ideas? I think also in terms of equality, I would also call for poverty reparations so that we can try to actually level things out and go forward in a far more sustainable fashion.
Thank you very much, Cleo. And finally, in this introductory session, Alan Lane. Alan, thank you.
Good morning. I'm speaking to you from Yorkshire. I'm based up in Leeds, and I'm aware that Leeds is an incredibly two-speed city. The city centre is one of the most successful parts of the country, with an awful lot of achievement and a lot of wealth generation. And the outside, large parts of the outside are locked out of that. I'm based in Holbeck, part of inner city, South Leeds, and a lot of the glories of our city are based in the city centre, where people are more and more encouraged to behave like customers and not citizens. We see large swathes of our city centres now privately owned. We see our collective common wealth institutions driven towards income generation and alternative sources of income, which means that large parts of our society are not able to engage with that. So one of the things we're really interested in here is how do we create spaces for people to be other than customer. We're convinced by people that customer is the most powerful role we can play, and I think citizen is. I think customer allows us to choose from a very small selection of choices designed by other people. And in this COVID time, we've become the ward lead for social care referrals. So basically, we run a mobile food bank servicing 7,500 homes and doing all sorts of things, prescriptions, dog walkings, all sorts of stuff. And the extraordinary thing about that for this conversation is that we have 100 volunteers, and we've been in that community for 10 years, and I've never met one of the volunteers. So I got 7,500 homes, and 100 people have turned up to volunteer almost every single day, 7 days a week, to help their neighbour. And I've never met them. And I run public events 3 or 4 times a week. Where do these people come from? Where are these absolute heroes? There's this moment, this opportunity here they seized to become powerful citizens. And we've been doing that for nearly 2.5 months. We're exhausted. I mean, look at the state of me. As we slowly start to expand and as we start to slow down in our response to COVID, the city council is coming back in to take over. Roger that, Chair. And there's a moment here where we can capture that power. We can capture that powerful citizenship, this mutual aid support, that those 100 people should not go back to their houses, go back to shopping in Sainsbury's once a week and go to the theatre once a year, that they are now in part of our society. And we need to find the mechanisms, the bravery to change our systems, to be able to really bring them close. Because I think that's how cities start to work for everyone, when people feel like they're powerful parts of it.
Thank you very much, Alan. There's many points came up there which I want to pursue in the discussion that follows, plus also to respond to the questions that are coming in. I wanted to open up a first question to everyone, really. And it follows on from some of the things that Cleo talked about and Alan talked about. And I want to start with Jess, though, because there is a view that things like democracy are in trouble, that trust is dropping in key institutions and so on, although we've seen this enormous output of affection and support for the major institution which affects all our lives, the National Health Service. I mean, do you think the system works for young people, Jess? And if not, how would you make that better? Would you like to have voted at 16, for example?
I personally think it all starts with education. Myself, in terms of political awareness, it's only really been since I've been auditioning for drama school and I moved up to Sidcup in order to get this higher education. And that was all thanks to Dave Orme, especially at Salisbury Playhouse, for teaching me about all of these opportunities that I wasn't aware I could achieve or attain. In terms of, again, political awareness, unfortunately, there's not a focus in schools. So even, I think, giving people the vote at 16 would be fantastic for young people to have their voices heard. But it's not going to achieve anything if young people at 14, 15, 16 aren't being given a non-biased education about the different political parties, about political history, about what politics is, what it means to people, what it can do. I think a lot of people, especially my friends from back home, we very much grew up with the idea of, oh, when you're 18, you suddenly understand politics. And then it came to voting and we were like, I have no idea about politics. So I think there are many things that can be done, but it all starts, especially from a young perspective, with basic education and understanding about the political system, the history of it, and how we can get our voices heard, not just through voting, but through campaigning, through reading, through interacting with MPs and people who are advocating for political parties, understanding it. Whereas right now, I don't feel like there's a political focus until you do hit voting age at 18. And then suddenly, if you don't know about politics, then you're an idiot. Whereas I think that isn't the attitude we should have. We should encourage people from a young age to get educated about politics, because I never was growing up. So I feel like I'm a little bit behind on my knowledge of where I should be as a nearly 21-year-old woman. So,
well, let's just interact with a couple of politicians we've got on the panel. John, I wanted to come to you. I mean, there has been the Citizens' Assembly on climate emergencies that took place across the country, or national. And you have had to rapidly change the way you work as an MP, you know, working remotely, voting rather than going through the lobbies and so on. Do you see permanent change happening in terms of the the reforms that you've had to introduce temporarily? And do you think political education is important? I mean, I'm always surprised. I learnt about these things at school, I must say, but when I work with young people and talk to them, it doesn't seem to happen these days. So I'm not sure what's gone wrong. So anyway, John.
Well, I mean, I think there are 64 schools in my constituency, and I've been to virtually all of them, and I have people on work experience all the time and do everything I can to try and get people engaged in politics. I mean, I can't do all of that myself. I think there are some real challenges. I think I'd like to pick up on something that Alan said about being a sort of customer or a consumer all the time. And I wonder sometimes if that's involved in our politics, that it's like, what are you going to do for me, rather than how do we come together as a community to deliver something for our wider society in a city where we live. And, you know, Alan's description of what's happened in the suburbs of Leeds, you know, resonates with what I've seen, and I've seen all my time in Salisbury. You know, the Trussell Trust food banks were founded in Salisbury. There's always been, even in relatively affluent parts, wealth inequality through the generations. The question is, what can you do to bind people together and to actually have enduring change? So I do think that there is a challenge in terms of political education. And you know, not to create a situation that's so binary. I think what Jess said was really powerful in terms of having a non-biased approach. You know, sometimes I've gone into schools and have just felt, you know, the vibes have not been good, because there's a whole sort of culture that says if you're a Conservative MP, then you've got to be evil. You know, now I understand where that comes from sometimes, and people's frustrations with the political system, but for most of the time, politicians of all colours are trying to do the best by their community. In terms of the question, Andrew, about the changes in Parliament, you know, we've had to do remote voting for the obvious reasons around COVID and social distancing. I think there are some significant disadvantages to that in terms of relationships not being able to be developed. You know, one of the best aspects of the way we vote in normal times is the interaction that you have with ministers, if you're not a minister, or that my colleagues now have with me as a minister, to hear what's going on the ground. And, you know, so yes, there are some things that I'm sure we'll look at doing differently permanently. And certainly the remote working and thinking about the financial services industry in Leeds and other places throughout the country, you know, they've all been working from home easily. The question is, how do we embed the good aspects of that? I think in terms of congestion, commuting and all of that, there's some interesting challenges. But I've deviated off your question. I'm sorry. I'll shut up now.
We will come back to some of these points. Cleo, I know in Bristol there's been discussion about citizens' assemblies and whether they're appropriate. You've led some of those discussions, and I mean, both to you and to Alan, in terms of renewing democracy at the city level, how important are these, do you think? And I'll start with Cleo and then go to Alan.
I think they're a potentially very good way forward. And as you mentioned, Bristol City Council, we did pass a motion several months back for the administration to agree that we would invest in citizens' assemblies. So that is very much on the cards. But like a lot of things in the mechanisms of the council working, these things can be very slow. So my feeling on that, and again, it was set up specifically in mind of the climate citizens assembly around that topic, but of course quite quickly recognized that it has to be broader than that. So it will be broader than that, but I would like to encourage people and different stakeholders to get on and don't wait actually for the council to sign off and say, great, here's a little bit of funding, let's make it happen. People need to get around and start doing it themselves. And they are actually. Theatre Bristol I would say, has stood out as being the great advocate at the moment and actually forming these assemblies to bring artists together, the creative sector together to have these discussions. So it is happening. I think it would be encouraging for different demographics to have their own assemblies so they can manage, develop, plan internally and then collaborate with the other assemblies as well. When we think about youth, they could have their own assembly. Of course, we've got the Youth Council, but again, how far reaching is that? And what impact does it make? Or is it just a case of a few events happen and then a handful of people come and report back to us adults at the AGM once a year? You know, we did also pass a motion for votes at 16 and e-democracy, which, you know, we're under more pressure now to make happen, which is great. And I actually think there is an opportunity for this to be more inclusive, because not everyone can make it to every council meeting, but right now people can actually get online, if they can get online, and engage with that. But what I'd also say is, in terms of youth, it's important about how we as adults, politicians, or the creative sector, whoever, can actually nurture what's happening out there. We've seen a huge wave of political activity amongst young people with the climate strike. But how are we supporting these young people? I saw this as well in 2016 in my own community, when actually, similar to where we are now in terms of our view, lens, and relationship with what's happening in America, young people from the African and Caribbean community took to the streets in their own Black Lives Matter demonstration, which saw, you know, several hundred young Black people take to the streets, which has never been seen before in Bristol at all. But then how were those young people supported to continue with momentum, to keep some kind of activity going? Because otherwise it just fades.
And thanks, Cleo. And Alan, the outpouring of community involvement you've encountered and you described earlier on, how do we continue to get people like that engaged in the wider political life of the city?
I think it's really hard for those with power to share it. I think, and that's not because they're evil. It's because they don't want to mess up. I think if you're in the city council, you don't. It's messy. 100 volunteers is not the most efficient way of delivering 100 food parcels. You get the guy that works for Amazon to do it in his van, but you are not going to get the same level of investment, and that's not a political act. It's a business operation. So I think we have to have a higher threshold for. It's more confusing when you have more voices, and I think also the systems across from, you know, I'm in the theatre, from, you know, sit on an equity committee and die and slow and lingering death of boredom, and that's true of, I mean, goodness me, I mean, I love the city council here, as long as they keep giving me money, but my goodness, the meetings there will grind you down, and I would imagine it's exactly the same in the House of Parliament. Our systems are designed for people, for a certain type of person, a certain type of energy, and they nearly always defend the status quo. They make change very difficult, and so we find ourselves in my city. I am the man that goes into meetings, shouts for 5 minutes, goes away and does it on my own anyway, and that is a role we recognise around the place. There was a brilliant Radio 4 documentary last week called Spark, which was about, I've forgotten his name, but the guy that set up the Independent Party in Frome that ended up taking over the whole city council, which was an extraordinary, sort of like he sounded like, you guys will know down there better than I, but like a Buddhist monk who just sort of circumnavigated took over a parish council and started doing what he wanted, which I was like, that's a guy. So I think we have to start by sharing power and a really old-fashioned thing, honour, fairness and honour. I don't think people want to be involved in a system unless they feel it's fair and the people in it are honourable. If they feel like they're having the mickey taken out of them, they won't give their time. But if they turn up and they see, exactly as John said, if they see the people at the top of whatever tree it is working as hard as they can for citizens in a fair and honourable way, they will put their shoulder to the wheel. But the minute that trust is betrayed, they won't ever come back. And I think there is a moment here, from our clapping to our delivering to everything, we've come together as a country in the face of real difficulty. But we must meet those people with fairness and honour, and if we don't, then they'll turn tail and we will not see them again.
Thanks very much. I want to bring in a few of the audience questions now. and I'll start with you, John, on this one. All of a sudden, the state is taking a very important role in people's lives and work, particularly with the furlough scheme. And we know there were announcements yesterday about the tapering of that scheme. You must have been centrally involved in a lot of these discussions and the implications in terms of the economy and so on. Do you see this bigger state continuing to function? And can you link that with the role that you started with about wealth generation in cities as being critical, particularly in supporting businesses through the furlough scheme and beyond the furlough scheme as well?
Well, clearly nobody would have wanted us to be in this situation. You know, people are suffering, people are at home detached from their loved ones and are, you know, under serious strain. And, you know, what we've done is we've done what I think any responsible government should do, which is to intervene to help people get through these extraordinarily difficult and unusual times. We've never had an economic shock like this in our country's history, so it's demanded unusual interventions. The philosophy of the Chancellor and the approach to it, I think, has been brilliantly non-partisan, and he's tried to actually make interventions that preserve as much capacity in the economy so that we can get back into the right trajectory as quickly as possible. But I'm very sensitive to the opportunities that exist for us to do things differently going forward. But in terms of the size of the state, it's more about how we enable a return to levels of economic activity that allow us to generate the tax revenues to invest in our infrastructure. And, you know, there's not some magical moment where money just appears. You know, in Salisbury, we are the first full fibre city. You know, I've reached out and to Openreach, 95% of the city is enabled. That is, you know, private investment that's going to allow people, even in all sectors, but even in arts and culture, to do things differently, to collaborate across boundaries in ways that you've seen happening in Manchester and Birmingham and our big cities. So there isn't a template for the size of the state, but the state has a role to enable growth and you know, individuals to, you know, prosper. And for different people, that will be different things. But we've also got to recognise, I think, as all the panellists have alluded to, that, you know, community exists. And I hope we also can just move away sometimes from headlines. You know, actually, I want a really thorough review of what has and hasn't worked. So I've got enormous respect and will be clapping for the NHS frontline workers, but I want to understand what's happening within the structures and processes of the NHS over the last 20 years that has got us to the situation we're in now. Is it all about money, or is it actually more fundamental? And do we have the honesty to actually interrogate that in a way that actually allows us to build something better going forward? So building something better going forward is what the priority should be. On democracy, and I just wanted to refer back to some of the comments around that, you know, the question for me around citizens' assemblies is their interaction with, you know, city councillors and unitary councillors. In Salisbury, we've got some brilliant city councillors across all parties who are pretty non-partisan, who do their very best. They are a parish council. Now, you know, at a time where we've got questionable levels of engagement, how do we avoid that being duplicatory and, you know, more into conflict? Because actually, for many older people and the digitally excluded, you know, there isn't, you know, there are different challenges, and I, as the Member of Parliament, have got to be cognizant of all age groups as well.
Okay. Thank you very much, John. Just a quick question to Cleo. Local authorities, you're a councillor. Local authorities are often on the front line of delivery services and so on in the city. What particular issues, it's probably too early to tell in a way, but what changes would you see needing to happen to local authorities' ability to deliver services coming out for the better future of the city?
Delivering services, it's been a struggle before this period. We know through austerity that actually a lot of services have been cut. So how you prioritise according to budget is always going to be a challenge, which is why the idea of the city office was a good one, of collaborating with other stakeholders in the city, other institutions, but that has to move beyond conversation to action. And I'm sitting and I'm waiting and I'm hoping that I'll see some big actions coming out of the people who could make, the institutions that could make a huge difference in the city in a very tangible way that is needed right now. So again, it can't just be the duty of the city council. And I think part of the problem is, even in terms of engagement, people have kind of been led down this idea of a dependency culture, institutions that don't actually serve you. So it's a kind of double no-win. So moving forward, it has to be a radical rehauling of the whole system, really, because for so many of our citizens, it isn't working. It isn't working nationally, it isn't working locally, it isn't working globally.
Thank you, Cleo. That brings us on to a point I want to ask the other two panellists. Cleo mentioned the City Office in Bristol, which brings together lots of different interest groups and individuals for the future of the city, led by the Mayor. There's been a question about leadership and the boards that we have, and I just wanted a quick response from both Jess and Alan on this one, about how we make sure that we encourage and engage wider groups of people to become involved in leadership and to become involved in boards of management of important institutions and structures within the city. I'll start with you, Jess.
Again, I think it all is one big circle of education and opportunity. It walks a fine line with how we see gender, especially gender roles in society, and luckily, 21st century, we're making some great moves to get away from that and to be a freer, more welcoming society, a you can do anything society, which I think now is the time that we should really be encouraging that. But in order to reach out to people, I think it is a case of saying, if you put your mind to it and you work hard, it might be difficult and it might take a very long time, it might be a very long process, but you can do it, you can get involved. And in order to start that process, it's really important to get that into people's heads, for lack of a better phrase, from a young age, and encourage people to think, this is an attainable thing. Leadership isn't for a specific type of person. It shouldn't be for a specific type of person. It should be for someone who is a good leader and puts the community first, and there's no cookie cutter shape. And I think personally, I did grow up thinking, oh, okay, well, I'm probably just gonna stay home and raise children and live that sort of white fence idealistic life. Whereas in reality now, I'm educated, I'm involved, I am on fantastic panels like this discussing things that are really important. And that came from me doing my own research and questioning things myself, but some people don't have the opportunity to do that, and some people don't have the faith in themselves that they can do that. So I think in order to get people involved in leadership and having these really important discussions, it's important from a young age that we really instill this value of you are enough and you are worthy, regardless of your skin tone, your age, your gender, to take part in these really important community discussions, because otherwise they won't happen.
Thank you. And Alan, how would you how would we encourage more people to get involved in organisations that reflect the wider community of a place?
I think Jess is right. I agree with her. I also think it's about making sure that at the highest levels we understand the power of the different experience of diversity. If you want your organisation, I mean, working theatre, if you want your organisation to be different and you've got 8 board members and they're all white men and titans of industry, then you will have a specific worldview. And the idea that those are the only skills you need is probably not that useful. If you're looking for someone who's really great at organising large amounts of information and being really efficient, then yes, you can hire the guy that runs a blue chip company, or you can hire a woman who brought up 3 kids on her own, because they both have exactly the same levels of skill. And I think that if the boards and the powerful governing things of our society had more diversity in them, then we would see our organisations behaving differently, especially when we come under pressure like COVID and we have to start making decisions really quickly. An awful lot of institutions ran to centre and were very conservative because that's all they knew. That's what they thought their job was.
Okay. I've got a specific question about Salisbury, but it's one that's common to all cities, or fairly common to all cities. And I'm going to start with the two Salisbury people and then come wider on that. And it's talking about, we've had two questions, in fact. It's talking about issues of inequality in Salisbury, about closing that gap. And like a lot of cities, you know, there is great wealth and sometimes great poverty. Bristol is a good example of that. And this has an impact on things like council taxes and rental properties and so on. How do we begin to bring together, how do we begin to solve these problems of inequality? And the particular question that was asked first of all was about, especially for people with disabilities. So if we could take that, plus also the wider question about bridging the inequality gap in places. And I'll start with you, John, on this.
Well, I think the challenge is always to embed in decision making an awareness of the needs of the most diverse groups across our community, and call out some of the contradictions. It always challenges me in Salisbury, where we've got an opportunity to build 400 or 500 houses, and I always remind people that 40% of those will be for social housing. And when I pick up the local paper, the dominant messages I get are not about the opportunity to bring housing for Jess's generation. It's the fact that their existing views will be changed, and even if there's elaborate plans for green spaces for people to enjoy and to encourage people to be able to use bikes and to walk into the city, there's always resistance. I think within all bodies that you need to actually, as Wiltshire Creative have so skillfully done, made sure that they've got a programme of work, reaching out to people with learning difficulties, with different needs across the community. I think reflecting on what Alan said, you talk about the sort of titans of industry and the single mother. I don't think they have the same skills, but they have equal complementary contributions, which together give us a better framework. And I think one of the challenges we have in terms of government and politics, I grew up in a home where my parents left school at 16, and my mother was a hairdresser. My father was made pot plants, so grew pot plants, no political background. And, I think I'm very interested in what Jess has said about actually getting people to feel that they can make a contribution. And it is about making a contribution. It's not owning anything or having power. People mistake MPs sometimes for having power. We're part of the political process, but locally, what I try to do is facilitate collaboration and bring every voice together. So I think that's the sort of framework and mindset we need at a local level to make things happen. And also be honest about some of the contradictions and some of the trade-offs that we have to make if we're going to deliver on some of the priorities for different generations and different groups who feel marginalised.
Thank you. And Jess, one of the issues that affects, whenever I talk with young people, one of the issues is really high housing costs. And does what John said there resonate with you about lack of housing provision? And what do you think we should do about this, plus wider issues of inequality in Salisbury itself? Because you're kind of on the front line there.
I definitely agree with what John has said about the contradictions. Like the same people, unfortunately, who think, oh, this homelessness epidemic is such an awful thing, we should build more houses, are the same people who are complaining because they might not have a nice view onto a 100-acre field in their back garden. And unfortunately, compromises need to be made. And if people are going to be contradicting themselves, then how do they expect people who are in power, who can make those decisions, to do anything about it? Unfortunately, there is quite an age gap in the city, and it's a beautiful city. I absolutely love living here. But the reality of it is, in my lifetime, unless I hit it big and start winning Oscars when I get my degree, I'm not going to be able to afford to buy a house here. I probably can't afford rent unless I'm house sharing or living with someone who can afford it. The only way at the moment I'm going to be able to afford housing as a young person is to stay at home and help my dad, who is an amputee. So it's really important for me to be here in case anything goes wrong, God forbid. But I can live here outside of term time and give him rent money or help around the house. But realistically, that's the only way I'm going to be able to afford housing. And as more and more generations come forward and are born and experiencing the world, it's getting more and more progressive. And people who are stuck in their ways, so to speak, are really hindering that process of making the community a better, fairer place. Again, to go back to my first point, the same people who think that homelessness is awful aren't doing the things to stop that problem. So it's not just homelessness, it's young people not being able to afford housing. One of my oldest brothers, for instance, he's got 4 beautiful children and he works every single day of the week. Really, really hard labour. My sister-in-law works every single day of the week and they're both raising the children and they still can't afford to move out of their 3-bedroom home. And it's kind of like, what lives are we giving these young children who want to get involved, but they're constantly living with all of these barriers and walls in order to make progress? If they can't if they can see their parents who are working so hard not being able to financially access these things to improve quality of life, then how are they going to grow up thinking that they can achieve that when the reality is they can't?
Thank you very much. I want to bring in another question, but linked to some of those things we've been talking about to the other 2 panellists. I'll start with you, Alan. One of the questions is about, and you raised this in your introductory comments, so I'm glad we've come back to this, is about the balance that we need to get right about regenerating, creating brilliant city centres that work for everyone, plus also the more, whether it's the suburbs of a place or the areas outside the city centre. And I'd like to ask both you and Cleo about that and what do we need to do there. I'm going to ask everyone now to be really short if possible, because I'd quite like to get another couple of questions in from the audience, but I'll start with you, Alan.
For me, this is about what we're for and our values, and I think Jess spoke really eloquently just now about that we're not willing to pay the price of what it is we want. So as John mentioned, we want to be able to drive into we want to be able to cycle into the city centre, but we still want to be able to drive our car. We want our children to be able to afford. I remember being in Stratford-upon-Avon, and nobody could afford for their children to have the houses nearby, but nobody was willing to vote for affordable housing to be built. And I think that I'm 40. What I've seen in the last 20 years is an absolute race to the bottom morally, an absolute race to the bottom of if everyone else is cheating the system, why shouldn't I? Why, honestly, do I have to abide the rules when come on? And it's not Dominic Cummings, and it's every single example of that we've had, where we go, why should I be in this society and graft and put up with something in order to give it to my children, or even better, to not give it to my children but someone else's? And I think we've lost confidence and we've lost love in that idea of it was brilliant to hear John say community exists and it needs to be cherished. And again, the really old-fashioned idea will only be just with honour. When people are honourable to each other, they will understand that they can't drive their car in the city centre in order to be able to let other people bike ride.
Cleo, there's a really interesting issue around here, and it comes up time and time again in terms of intergenerational issues. Do you feel that certain people are going to have to give up certain things that they cherish in cities to allow greater equality?
Absolutely, there's going to have to be compromise moving forward. And again, at least the element of climate has kind of started to open up people's eyes to see things from a different perspective, and for them to understand that planetary repairs have to start with tackling social inequality, for example, or even through this period we're in now, people have started to maybe accept that certain people are at a huge disadvantage in society, and that disadvantage can equal death. I think for me, I always think of what would it be like as an alien, in inverted commas, looking down on our country and how we operate. It would be so bizarre, because what seems to run rife is the element of selfishness and individuality, and that is not sustainable. So we need wealth redistribution, and going back to what Jess has spoken about as well, we need laws in place. If we're going to work with the regime, then we need laws in place to enforce things like rent caps and universal basic income, so that everyone can have dignity wherever they are. And that's the thing for me, there should always be dignity in poverty, and right now we don't have that.
Thank you very much. There's many issues there that I'd love to spend hours discussing, of things like universal basic income and intergenerational issues and so on. But we've sadly only got 8 minutes left. But we will come back to those in future debates, I'm sure. I wanted to just finally ask the panellists' views on, well, I've got one final question, which is coming from the audience, so that's one line answer from everyone at the end. But I wanted to talk about, culture and arts have been mentioned a lot. It's pretty central to most people's lives. Most cities are known for the quality and extent of their culture and the arts, but we have a particular problem at the moment with COVID-19. I said I wouldn't say that, but I've said it. In that it's likely that the things that we, a lot of us cherish about cities, the ability to go to the theatre, the cinema, to walk in a park and so on, a lot of these are likely to be the last things to be opened. And these are things which give cities wealth as well. So just a quick roundup from each of you about the importance of that to you, but also how we can move it forward to get things back going again, and to get the culture going. John, I'm going to start with you, because you're a former culture secretary as well. However short-lived that was, you did travel around a lot.
Yeah, I did 6.5 months as the Junior Arts, Heritage and Tourism Minister in the second half of 2017. I visited 114 venues around the country. It was a great privilege, and I saw, the different ways that arts and culture have been embedded in the way that places worked. And, for me in Salisbury, what I want the arts and culture to be at the core of our city's future. As the face of retail changes, we have a massive tourism sector and independent retail sector in Salisbury, but that won't sustain us. What we need to do is we need to also add to that, something really fundamentally additional with our arts and cultural offer. Now, you're right to say that the current challenges mean that this sector is facing particular issues on the pathway back to normality because of the health concerns that exist. And we've tried to put in a range of interventions with the furlough scheme, which I know Wiltshire Creative have used and been grateful for. But what we've also got to do, I think, is in a national campaign to get out and support your local venues when we can in the later parts of this year. And I think that is something that is really needed. I found, and I think everyone finds, engagement with arts and cultural activities. And we have the Chalk Valley History Festival that sadly was postponed just down the road. We have a brilliant books festival, literary festival that's got going in the city over the last few years. All of these things, help us get through life's ups and downs. They give us perspectives outside our own daily experience. They enrich our soul, and they're great things to happen. And what we've got to do is work collaboratively to build the right solutions in different places around the city.
That's good to hear. I'm not going to ask all the panelists actually on this because we've got limited time, but I wanted to ask Alan and then come to Jess and Cleo about two other questions. But Alan, your view about, you're centrally involved in culture within your place. What's going to get you back up and running properly again?
There was a campaign last week nationally from the sort of the grandees of British theatre saying that without a major investment of cash, then what we understand to be the live performance sector simply will not exist. And I think that they are absolutely correct in that. I think that's what must happen, or we must pay the price of not doing that, which will be to have a much smaller offer. I think also there's something for us to do in the arts, and we have to plead with the Exchequer for help, but we also need to make sure that we're still being as vital as we can to our communities. There are other things we can do. I think there is more flexibility in the furlough scheme now. there are ways, and it's happening, that theatres are still providing creative opportunities. I know we have a lamppost gallery with 100 paintings drawn by the people who live in our community. We put on live stream game shows. There are just loads of ways in which we can still be vital to our community, as well as also pleading. And I think that if we're not telling stories in this moment of desperation, in which our communities can see themselves as part of our cultural offer, then when we come back and we're like, guys, we're open again, it's going to be 45 quid for a Wizard of Oz ticket, we're going to find that the people who didn't care about us before aren't all of a sudden going to be caring for us now. And that's, there again, there's an opportunity here. There are people desperate. We're delivering creativity packs, tomato plants, storybooks. There's all sorts of things we can do. No, none of them are going to be a major show starring Patrick Stewart, and they aren't going to make any money for people, but they are going to be vital at a moment when people need it. And I think they'll remember that.
Okay, thank you. Just two questions. I'll bring in finally Jess and Cleo. There's been a question from the member of the audience about one thing that you can do to get young people into politics. Jess, you've talked about a few things, but what's the one thing you would focus on in terms of getting young people into politics?
It's all about advertising and communication. Most young people, I can't speak for all, because not everybody has a phone or a laptop or a tablet or anything to access the internet from. But most people will sit there all day on their phones and they'll see adverts for diet pills, adverts of the next bikini sale, adverts of XYZ, all of this poisonous stuff. Whereas you can have local pages on Instagram, Facebook, I'm sure there are, but really, really push out the messages of you can get involved. Here's a question, write in an answer, give us your questions, or like competitions, anything online I think is so important. Posters, going into schools and handing out leaflets and flyers, being relentless about pushing forward this idea of it's everybody's responsibility to take part in the history of a community in a city, be that politically, be that through arts, be that through education. We need to try and encourage young people through advertisements and flyers, etc., and constantly instill that there are better things that we could be spending our time with than scrolling through and looking at the newest workout plan on Instagram. Like, let's put our time to something better.
Okay. And Cleo, one final word from you?
Yeah, my approach to engage more youth would be to infiltrate gaming, so to get more people making gaming that has that political element subtly. And also similar to, what was attempted with the city poet that we have in Bristol, using people who are icons in youth culture within our city to be the voice. So can people deliver a political message or a campaign through emceeing, music? We've had a very successful M32 bars challenge amongst the MCs in our city. How can we elevate them to be our leaders of our youth?
That's great. I'm afraid we've run out of time, and there are many more subjects we'd like to cover. But before thanking everyone, I want to say this has been part of What Next for the City, a festival of ideas produced by Wiltshire Creative that is part of the Salisbury 2020 Big Weekend. Over this weekend, there are other panels considering the future of cities all over the world, plus presentations about extraordinary aspects of Salisbury's past. So I want to thank particularly Alan Lane, Cleo Lake, Jess Clark, John Glen for participating today. I'd also like to express my thanks to the team from Wiltshire Creative I've worked with, Michael Scott, Fiona Curtis and Ali Robertson. And thank you to the audience for participating, and we look forward to further debates to come. So thank you very much and have a good weekend. Thank you.